Alright, FMS fans, we are going to do a Metal Gear upgrade in an LC80 transmission today. So this is for the 18 scale and 24 scale cars. Should be pretty much identical. I think the only real difference is the motor size on some of the 24s is a little bit smaller. This is the Metal Gear set, so it does come with everything from the sprocket gear from the front side of the transmission and all the other little gears for the low speed and high speed transmission for the 2-speed. This is part number C3062. They are available on FMS models and FMSHobby.com. So first of all, we're going to take apart this transmission, and we're going to start with a small Phillips screwdriver just to pull apart the universal joints here. You don't have to remove these screws all the way, just enough until they come off. And that leaves the screw in the universal joint, easy to put back together when we reassemble it, and you don't lose screws. So same thing on that. I just gently pull on it as I'm pulling the screw out until it comes off. Then we're going to remove the servo here that changes the gears. We're going to try to mental note of the orientation. So this is to the right, which is in the high speed mode. So when we pop that off and put it back on, we can adjust it if we're testing. But in this case, we're going to hope that we put it back together and put it in the truck and hope that it doesn't need adjustment. So once you've got those main parts taken off there, we can take apart the servo, because we do need to get to the front side of this transmission. So we're going to remove the servo altogether. If you do have a 1.5 millimeter hex on something like this, a little pen drill, it does make the job a little bit quicker sometimes. And all these screws that are the same size, it doesn't really matter where they go, they're all the same size, 1.5 millimeter hex with machine screws here. So all these ones that are the same size, I just kind of put them all together. So we've got the servo out, we can put that aside, and then we can pull off the servo mount. This part, I believe, is where there might be a screw or two that are longer or shorter than the rest. Nope, so this just came off with that. This went here. So just so we can make a mental note when we take this off again and put it back together, this little arm here goes over the gear selector linkage, or the gear selector rod. It goes over it and underneath that servo mount screw. So that servo mount screw is right there. So just to keep things simple, I'm going to leave all these screws in here and leave this all together and assemble just like this on the table, so when we go to put it back together, there's no confusion there. One last screw for the front side here. And now I think those screws all look like they're the same size as well. So no surprises there. And then you can take off that front cover. And you'll have a long rod and your gear. So the pinion gear coming out of the motor is already metal, and so we don't include that in because there's no reason to upgrade something that's already upgraded or something that's already metal. So we'll go ahead and remove this gear, pull the rod out of the center of it. And we'll open up our gear set here. Alright, and here's the gear we are replacing. We'll put this rod back into it. Throw a little bit of grease on it. So I kind of just glob it on there. Make sure there's plenty in there. Nice thing is this gear has holes in it, so that grease will drip through and shouldn't have any lubrication issues on front or back. And then we can just drop this right back into the housing. The gear that protrudes from it goes into the other side of the transmission. And your cover goes back on. It's going to push that rod all the way through till it goes right back on to where it was. So no need to unbolt the motor or anything to do this job. Just pulling off the servo there, no big deal. So this screw is going to go back into the top right. And the servo mount. I'm going to go ahead and put this one on that gear selector first. And the servo mount goes over all this. Just line up the screws and tighten them up. I'm going to hold off on putting the servo back on it right now just to make it easier to handle. And then I'm going to loosen up these 3 screws on the back side of the transmission. These 2 screws are relatively easy to get to, and then one of them is in between the motor and the transmission housing. This one's a little more difficult, and I don't have an extension long enough to get to it with the tool, so I just got to do it by hand. Alright, once we've got the 3 screws out, you can just kind of wiggle and pull the back side of the transmission off. Sometimes this gear sticks into the housing, but not a big deal either way. So this one simply comes off. We'll put that aside. Got this one. This one. These are stepped gears, so they have 2 gears, a larger and a smaller. And then the rod comes out. And then this whole linkage assembly. And there is another washer that's on the back side of this gear. Sometimes it sticks to the gear, and in this case it didn't. It stayed in the housing. So I'm just going to leave it right there. I'm not going to touch it. You can also see the gear that we already replaced on the front side of the transmission is coming through here because that's also a stepped gear. Alright, the gears that go back in here right now, we can go ahead and put one of the stepped gears in. Throw a little bit of grease on the back side of it. That can go on this center rod. And just push that down in there. You need to turn it a little bit until it engages the teeth with the other gear. And then if you want, you can put in the other one. And these can go in now, or they can go in after the gear selector gears. But I'm just going to put them in right now. Alright, so those are in there like that. Alright, so let's get to this gear selector linkage. This can be a little tricky for some people, and sometimes they're easier than others, but this is a tiny C-clip. I've had good luck with using a really small flathead, or the best thing I've ever used to take them off is something like this little paint scraper. It's thin enough that if you put it here, let's see if I can get a clear enough view. There we go, so that C-clip has 2 points, and they sit right here. So if you put the front of a blade or something, you can push on it just enough. Sometimes, there we go, to get the back side exposed, where you can fit a little tiny. And you can use a tip of like a needle or needle nose pliers, tip of a screw if it's small and sharp, to get this little C-clip off. So once you get that C-clip off, don't lose it. They're not easy to find. You can slide the gear selector off, which this one's on there pretty tight. I'm going to grab a part here on the end with a pair of pliers, not too tight, but just tight enough so that it doesn't move while I wiggle this off. There we go. Alright, so you can discard that. Alright, so when you put the gear selector on, you're going to have your rod this way the whole is over here to the right. That's where the gear selector servo shifts this back and forth. And the gear selector metal piece that you're replacing the nylon with is going to go on this direction because it has this little ridge on it. So pay attention. One side is completely flat and one side has a little lip or ridge. That ridge is going to go towards the shifter linkage hole. So it goes this direction. And then we put our C-clip back on here to retain this. This may be tricky for some with big fingers. And then a flathead screwdriver to go ahead and push that on. And you want to push it on until you hear it go click, like that. Alright, so make sure the C-clip is on all the way and that the rod can still spin. And that's that. Alright, so next thing we're going to do is put one of the keyed gears back in the box, in the transmission, into the gearbox. So a little bit of grease on the back side of it. And you can drop it in there like so. Then we are going to put a little bit of grease on this guy. And we're going to put the shifter key that goes between the gears on this. And we can drop that into place. Alright, once we get the gear selector key in place, we can take our drive shaft linkage. This connects the transmission to the universal joints. So you can drop that in the hole here and get all the gears lined up, kind of wiggle, turn it a little bit if necessary, until you get it all the way through the other side. You wipe off some of that grease that might come out with it, and then we can put on the other keyed gear. Go ahead and grease this up. Again, doesn't need a ton of grease, just a little bit, just to make sure everything stays lubed. Go ahead and put that on. There we go. Alright, and then that last washer that goes on there, pick that up, put that on the rod right there, and push it down. Alright, so that looks like everything we need. Nope. Alright. So once we've got all this, we've got one gear left, and that's the one that probably came off most of your transmissions with the housing, but if it didn't, it's right here. There's no key to it, it just goes right in the middle. You're going to drop that down and it's going to connect between these two gears, engaging with this gear and this gear. And that's it. We can go ahead and add a little more grease to all this. Just kind of squirt a couple of globs in there, and that'll keep everything lubricated. And we can pop the transmission housing back together. So just a little wiggle, a little pressure. Nothing needs to be forced. If it's not going, it usually means that there's something binding or things aren't straight. So a little bit of wiggling back and forth will usually settle it down. Sometimes you got to put one of the universal joints on here just to get things to move a little bit. There we go. See? So as soon as I did that, this housing sat right down where it's supposed to. There we go. Snap it in place. Before we put screws together, go ahead and put one universal joint back on. I'm going to spin this transmission. This feels like it's in neutral. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in high gear by pushing this rod forward and spin it. And the motor is now spinning. And the housing is sitting down nice and tight. Perfect. So now let's put these 3 screws back in. And these don't need to be super tight, just enough to keep the transmission together. This is the hard one to get to. And as you can see, the motor's magnetic, so the screw likes to just stick to the motor, making it more difficult. Alright, tighten them snug, but don't over tighten. 1, 2, 3. We're going to double check that this sounds and feels good. Now these are metal gears, so they are a lot noisier than the nylon gears, especially right out the box when they're still sharp from machining and they haven't worn themselves in yet. But go ahead and shift the transmission into both gears to make sure that it is engaging. The low gear, when the rod's all the way towards the back of the motor, is going to be significantly harder to turn because this is very low gear, so lots of torque from the motor. Make sure that it rotates all the way around, there's no binding or grinding, and this does sound perfect. So go ahead and put the other universal joint on. There we go. We can mount our servo. And the white servo gear is going to go towards the motor on that side, so we can reconnect our linkage. Alright, so once you've got your universal joints on, your servos on, the last thing is the linkage. Go ahead and put this linkage in, and we'll remember last time we had it, when we took it apart, it was in high gear, which is all the way to the right, so you can wiggle your transmission till you get it into high gear, and then go ahead and install that servo horn. Now I normally go ahead and plug this into the truck and turn on the truck, power it up, and test that function of the gear selector first before putting the last screw into this, just to make sure that it doesn't need to be adjusted before putting it back in the truck, because it's a little more difficult to get to than it is right here in your hand. But that is how to rebuild your transmission for your 24 scale or 18 scale trucks, your crawlers from FMS, and how to upgrade to metal gears. Now, whether you're changing out metal gears or just changing out to the stock nylon gears again, the process is exactly the same.